Today I want to discuss a few thoughts that I had while thinking about the situation in Ukraine and while listening to the videos and discussions made by other people on the internet. Let me begin by asserting a thesis. This thesis is that geopolitical struggles, wars, things of that nature, aren't just decided by the fighting that is going on at the moment, but that their outcome is, at least in large part, also decided in the Prelude Phase. So, as an example of this, let's think about the First Cold War. In the closing days of the Second World War, people understood that it was inevitable that the United States and the Soviet Union would clash following the defeat of Nazi Germany. And on both sides, you saw the political elite starting to prepare for this inevitable clash even before their common enemy, Nazi Germany, was defeated. And the most obvious way in which this preparation was made was in the creation of spheres of influence. Europe and Eastern Asia were both being divided into their respective power blocks by the two superpowers. However, one of the big reasons for why the United States was ultimately dominant in the Cold War rather than the Soviet Union being dominant is because this divvying up of countries and territories into spheres of influence happened massively more in the United States' favor. All of the big industrial powers, all of the historic empires, that is to say, the United Kingdom, Italy, Spain, France, Japan, as well as both parts of Germany and Korea that were the more industrialized, more densely populated parts of these countries. And other parts of the world, especially in the early decades of the Cold War, were pretty much completely dominated by the United States. Regions like the oil-rich Middle East, or Latin America, and Africa, where Western countries at the time still had many colonies on the continent, all of these regions were completely dominated either by the United States directly or by its allies/satellites. In the early years of the Cold War, the Soviet Union did not have so much as a foothold there. In other words, back during the First Cold War, the collective West had already secured such an overwhelming advantage during the Prelude Phase of the geopolitical struggle that it was apparent at all times which of the two superpowers of the time was the more powerful one. Now, it can be argued that because this divvying up of the world into spheres of influence happened so much in the United States' favor, that this then allowed the United States to keep up the momentum and ultimately defeat the Soviet Union. Or it can be argued that the fact that the world was divvied up in this way in the first place was an indicator that the United States was always geopolitically more powerful than the Soviet Union. And in my personal opinion, both interpretations have a lot of truth to them. But what both of these interpretations ultimately imply is that a winner of a conflict is ultimately decided largely in the prelude phase to that conflict. And the same also holds true for hot wars as well. For example, the Second World War was ultimately decided by the fact that the Allies, the Allied coalition, which coalesced against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, ultimately had a lot more resources and manpower to call upon than all of the Axis countries combined. And the same, more or less, applies to the actors in the First World War. And of course, this phenomenon isn't only exclusive to modern times, it can be seen in various other times throughout history as well. For example, during the Napoleonic Wars, where it can be argued that Napoleon's lack of a clear strategy and set of goals during the invasion of Russia led to the destruction of a large part of his army and paved the way for his ultimate defeat at the hands of the overwhelmingly superior coalition forces. Another example of this could be the Greco-Persian Wars, most notably the invasion of Persia by Alexander the Great. And of course, there are countless other examples of this phenomenon at play throughout history, where it is apparent as to who of the two opposing sides holds the stronger cards, and that side often ends up the winner. Of course, there are exceptions to this, but this is at least the general rule. And now let us extend this logic to the war in Ukraine. Let's take a minute to analyze what the prelude to the Ukraine war was and how it reflects as to who holds the stronger cards. And we can start by going all the way back to the 1990s and 2000s, when Russia struggled to secure control of Chechnya, a region from which it can now call upon additional manpower and experienced fighters to fight against the Ukrainian military. We can talk about the economic aspect of this war and how the Russian economy and Russian military industry developed since the end of the Cold War, whereas Ukraine's equivalent of these institutions and sectors stagnated and was essentially dissolved. We can also talk about global reactions and political support for both sides throughout the world, where it is very striking that the only countries which support Ukraine to any notable extent are the countries that are closely integrated into the political and military institutions of the collective West, of which the overwhelming majority has for decades and centuries been staunchly anti-Russian. In other words, the collective West hasn't managed to secure any new friends or allies in its quest against Russia, whereas pretty much the rest of the entire world either supports Russia or takes a neutral stance in this war and continues to have trade and political relations with Russia. But I would argue that the most important aspect in the prelude to this war were the unrest that the collective West tried to ferment in Russia using their puppet Navalny, who was very obviously being used to try to discredit the Russian government in 2018 and 2019, but also, very importantly, the attempted color revolution that took place in Belarus in 2020. This was the year when the collective West recognized a person whom nobody has ever heard of before, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, as more or less the legitimate ruler of Belarus. And of course, I'm oversimplifying things a little bit. There was an electoral process, there were allegations of electoral fraud, but that is the general gist of things. The West, for all practical intents and purposes, recognized this nobody as the legitimate ruler of Belarus. And if back then the color revolution in Belarus succeeded, then Russia's situation in this war in Ukraine would have been truly dire. Ukraine would have gained a land corridor, an economic corridor, through which it could receive vital supplies from Belarus, which would mean that there could be no talk about depriving Ukraine of natural resources, of fuel, or of any other important resources that it needs to fight the war, since all of these materials could be supplied to Ukraine through the additional corridor that would have existed through Belarus. At the same time, with Belarus cut off from Russia, Russia's own economic situation would have been a lot more dire. And of course, attacking Ukrainian forces from Belarus would be completely impossible for Russia. On the contrary, Russia would likely have to worry about the Belarusian army joining the war and fighting against Russia at that point. Now, some people might tell me that I'm exaggerating a little bit, that there is no way that the situation would have ever been so dire for Russia, and to some extent I agree. I agree because the plans of the collective West in creating this color revolution in Belarus were so harebrained that there was essentially no chance for them to have ever succeeded in the first place. But that is a discussion for another time. One more important thing that I will mention about the prelude to the Ukraine war was the unrest that took place in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan shares the world's second largest border with Russia. Kazakhstan's border with Russia is well over 7,000 kilometers long. And for all kinds of historic and geopolitical reasons, Kazakhstan is a very close ally of Russia. And the unrest that took place in Kazakhstan, when armed bands began roaming the streets of major cities in the country and started demanding the removal of Kazakhstan's president from office, all of this took place only a little bit more than 1 month before the war in Ukraine, when security talks between Russia and NATO discussing the limitations for NATO's further expansion near Russia were being hotly discussed. And the timing of all of this was clearly not a coincidence. To top it off, there were foreign elements that were involved in backing the riots in Kazakhstan. Although, in the interest of fairness, I should mention that this was not the typical color revolution playbook. This was a little bit different, but nonetheless, the ultimate effect, if such a revolution had succeeded, was that there would have been more trouble on Russia's borders leading right up to the war in Ukraine. And it is not at all impossible, in fact likely even, that whatever new government would have come to power in Kazakhstan would not have been pro-Russian. So with all of this in mind, it seems that the prelude to the war in Ukraine, the preparation phase, if you will, which started in 2014 with Crimea, much of this has went in Russia's favor. And Ukraine's successes during this time were pretty much all limited to clearing out their domestic political landscape from politicians, celebrities, and even everyday people who express pro-Russian sentiments. But this really isn't a big victory, especially since the exact same could be said for Russia as well. Russia has also had enormous successes in cleaning its political system of any individuals who might have sided with Ukraine or with the collective West over Russia's interests. So, in summary, the lead up to the Ukraine war, which has been happening for many years now, has by and large went in Russia's favor. And this is yet another sign, another indicator that Russia isn't going to lose the war over Ukraine. At least these are my thoughts, the thoughts that I wanted to share in today's video. I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, if you're watching this video on YouTube, please don't forget to hit that like button, since it helps the algorithm recommend this video to more people and helps the channel gain more traction. Also, if you haven't already, please be sure to check out my other channels on Telegram and on Rumble. Both of these are wonderful free speech platforms with no political censorship whatsoever. And Telegram in particular is an amazing platform since it allows me to give regular updates on various small topics without having to make entire videos on the subject. So there is a little bit of exclusive content, you could say, on my Telegram channel. All of the links will be in the video description. So if you're watching this on YouTube, the links in the description will be to my Rumble and my Telegram channel. If you're watching this on Rumble, they will be to my YouTube and my Telegram channel respectively. With that said, I thank you for watching this video, I hope that you've enjoyed it, and I wish you all a wonderful day.